Have you ever wondered why Mark chose women to find Jesus' empty tomb? I mean, I feel like it's very obvious a narrative reason or a theological reason. Mark rarely does anything that isn't for some kind of narrative purpose or theological purpose. And women finding the empty tomb serves both a narrative purpose and a theological purpose. And that theological purpose is to emphasize how the first shall be last and the last shall be first. This is acknowledged by a huge swath of scholars in the field. Not just critical scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman or anybody else that you would consider a critical scholar, but there are a number of other scholars as well that extends outside of those critical scholars that acknowledge the narrative necessity of women finding the tomb, and that this probably wasn't a historical event. During my deconstruction, that was one of the questions that I had, was an explanation for, things that happened in the gospel narrative and why those events in the gospel narratives were not historical. I needed to know those things. Well, today we're going to take a look at the rest of Than Christophilus' video where he tries to defend the empty tomb. So if you want to fuck around and find out why women finding Jesus' empty tomb is both a narrative necessity as well as a theological necessity, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Like I said, we're covering Exploring Reality's defense of the empty tomb from the aspect of women finding the empty tomb. Now, just to orient y'all to where we left off last time, there's this hypothesis that the women finding the empty tomb is a narrative necessity as well as a theological necessity. And that is the hypothesis that Than is going to be mentioning here at the very beginning of the video. Just like I emphasized in the first video, I highly suggest going and watching his original video. It's very well put together and he's got a pretty well thought out argument, so I think that it warrants consideration. What Than is hoping to do is to defend this idea that the empty tomb is a historical event and that Mark wouldn't simply just make this up for his narrative needs or his theological needs. All right, so let's jump on into the video.
You see, there's a lot of issues with this hypothesis. Let's just grant, for sake of explanation, that the skeptic is right and that Mark continues this theme of misapprehension and misjudgment on the part of the disciples. What doesn't follow from this hypothesis is that Mark would choose women to fill this role still. In fact, Mark could have written in a number of other characters in this invented narrative to make his point if this is what he was trying to do.
I agree that there are plenty of other ways in which this could have been written that do not use women finding the tomb empty. But is that really the best story that could be told? Now, obviously, I don't think that the Gospels are all that great of stories in the first place, but I feel like that's just a product of the time, although there are way better authors than whoever wrote the Gospels. I feel like it's a product of who wrote it. We don't know who wrote it, but we know at least that they were somewhat educated by pagan schools because it was written in Greek. And the only places that you can learn to write in Greek were in pagan schools. So it makes sense for, a lot of the different things that pop up in the Gospels for them to invent these kind of situations, like these types of events. But could they have written it differently? Sure. I don't see how this helps defend the empty tomb argument. I don't see how this ends up defending the empty tomb hypothesis that the empty tomb is a historical event. I feel like just because they could have written it different ways has no bearing on whether or not there was actually an empty tomb. I feel like having anybody else other than the women, like men, for example, men of any kind, whether that be Gentile men or one of the apostles that were men, having any of those people find the tomb rather than the women does break this theological necessity to emphasize that the least shall be first, like the least will be exalted up. And this whole idea is maintained throughout even the Old Testament because God regularly uses the least amongst the Israelites or the least amongst the Jews in order to emphasize his power and his influence. So this just keeps with that because of women's status in the Jewish system at the time, being that they were considered lower than men on a social level. I feel like putting the women at the tomb to be the first ones that recognize Jesus has resurrected from the dead and be the first ones that are revealed by some divine being that Jesus has resurrected, I feel like that heavily plays into this theological need to emphasize that the least shall be first, but also the narrative need to adhere to that principle as well, that theme that is rampant throughout Mark's gospel. The women are the easiest and the most likely characters to find the tomb empty. They were the last ones to see Jesus die, and they were the last ones to see where he was buried. And so naturally, in order to keep with this, the first shall be last and the last shall be first theme in Mark's gospel, it's very apparent that, having the women find the tomb empty is just logically implied. But still, this doesn't really get to his whole point here of, well, it could have been written differently. Okay, sure, it could have been written differently. I think that would have degraded the message. I don't think that it would have satisfied the same narrative needs that the women finding the tomb accomplishes. And also on a theological basis as well. Having anybody else find the tomb empty doesn't accomplish this theological need for emphasizing this revelation from God or God's influence on this situation. I feel like that's just theologically and narratively needed.
While Jewish women were certainly not equal with their male counterparts, there's a number of greater candidates that Mark could have used for this.
But I feel like what's highlighted here, or at least what should be highlighted, is the fact that there are greater examples. Not saying that they're better examples, but I'm emphasizing the use of the word greater here, implying that anybody else could have fulfilled this role in Mark's narrative. They would be greater than the least. And so having the least find it emphasizes God's influence. I'm getting this feeling from Than that this is a lot like a math equation here. 2 + 2 = 4. That's the normal narrative that Mark is currently presenting. But what Than is saying, well, 2 + 3, that equals 4 too. And I don't think that this is actually the case. I feel like if you change who finds the tomb empty, you're actually degrading the message that's being sent. And I don't think that you actually want to make an argument that degrades the message of the Gospels.
Imagine this scenario. Simon of Cyrene, accompanied by his sons Alexander and Rufus, witnessed the Roman soldiers removing the cross from his back and then nailing Jesus onto it. Unable to take their eyes away from the gruesome sight, the trio remains among the crowd as Jesus breathes his last breath and Joseph takes his body down, laying it in a nearby tomb. As the Sabbath passes, rumors and gossip about the execution of this revered rabbi and messianic figure swirl through the streets, piquing Simon's curiosity. He and his sons decide to pay the respects at the tomb, only to find it empty. From there, the events unfold as history tells us.
This is the same problem. Yeah, if we wrote it differently, then it would be different, which isn't a great argument to suggest women finding the tomb is historical. I don't find this to be compelling. Sure, he could have written it any number of ways. I'm sure that there is another universe out there where he did write it in a different way, maybe the exact way that Than is suggesting here. I feel like he's forgetting about this narrative portion of this, in that the disciples are dipshits, right? They are the ones that they believe in Jesus, and throughout Jesus's ministry in Mark's gospel, they are consistently dipshits. They are consistently dumb. Jesus repeatedly has to prove himself to them, right? And they repeatedly question him and everything. So in Mark's gospel, women finding the tomb empty, they go there not knowing how they're going to roll the tomb away, but they want to go to pay respects because they are still faithful to Jesus. They still believe in Jesus. They still love Jesus and all that. While the disciples, they've given up. After Jesus dies, their leader is dead. What's the point, right? They have given up on Jesus, much like how they gave up on him during his crucifixion and all that. They ran away scared and all this other shit, right? The women still remaining faithful to Jesus, they are rewarded by being revealed that Jesus has resurrected. And of course, the women, they ultimately fail too because they run away scared and they don't say anything to anybody. But again, this emphasizes this divine revelation from Jesus. And I feel like the way that Than is proposing for the story to be alternatively written degrades the message of the Gospels. This makes no theological or narrative sense.
In this version of the narrative, the Gentiles fulfill this motif role. Just like in Mark's Gospel, the Gentiles are the ones that see Jesus for who he is, while the disciples completely misunderstand who he is time and time again. So too now we have the Gentiles discovering the empty tomb out of paying respects for Jesus. If Mark's literary intentions here were to invent the empty tomb narrative to fulfill this motif, this is just one example of how he could have done it without including women.
But I don't think that it actually does fulfill it, because they were going there to pay their respects to a dead person. Obviously the women, they weren't going there expecting to find the tomb empty, but the women that were going there not to pay their respects but to anoint the body, meaning that they were going there to show love to it because they still felt connected to Jesus, like his body and everything like that. They weren't going there to mourn the dead, they were going there to anoint the body and show their love for Jesus. That's the big difference here, in the story that he's telling. I mean, obviously he could reword it and say, oh, well, they were going there because they loved Jesus and they wanted to show their respect and love to Jesus and all this other stuff. But I feel like this still degrades the story of finding the tomb empty and the story, the message of Jesus in general, like the impact that Jesus's resurrection had, the fact that Jesus revealed himself to people, that women were told that he resurrected and they went away scared and didn't tell anybody. And so Jesus revealed himself to other people. And that's the reason why Jesus is only known through revelation, is because nobody told anybody about the empty tomb. That is the rich narrative and theological context that Than is saying that you can just throw out. And I just simply don't agree.
Mark's options don't end there. If he wanted to invent the account to satisfy this literary motif, Mark could have had a Roman soldier, perhaps even the same one who recognized Jesus' true identity in Mark 15:39, to visit the tomb on Sunday morning to express his newfound conviction and conversion. That would certainly counter expectations.
Well, I mean, it may counter expectations, but does it actually accomplish the narrative and theological needs of Mark's story better than the women? I feel like the women are still the best option here. Are these alternative options? Sure. But they also degrade the message. For another thing, while the Roman soldier did recognize who Jesus was, being the Messiah from God and everything like that, I feel like the implication of Mark's narrative with that Roman soldier is that people learned too late about who he was. And in the story, at least. I'm not talking about history, obviously, but who he was in the story. And so the Roman guard didn't have time to devote himself to Jesus. He's not even depicted as devoting himself to Jesus. Who was already devoted to Jesus? Somebody that was already there. That would be the women that saw him die on the cross. They were already devoted to his message. They were already part of his ministry. And so they were already committed to it, and they did not give up until after, it was revealed that he resurrected. Obviously, they too ended up disappointing God or disappointing Jesus because, obviously the divine being was like, go and tell everybody, caw-caw! And they were like, fuck no, run away scared and everything like that, right? They obviously failed God too, and that's why God had to reveal himself to everybody. Well, God is Jesus, whatever, however in the fuck you want to interpret that theologically speaking. All of this is like a perfect puzzle being put together. And I feel like what Than is suggesting here is that we take a piece from a different puzzle and we just try to fucking jam it in there really good, and we can make it fit, right? But does it really fit as good as the women finding the tomb empty? I don't think so.
We also have a number of deaf, blind, paralytic, lepers, deaf, mute people that Jesus healed that could have easily fit this motif as well. All of these same people would have surely wanted to come and pay their respects to Jesus, the man who healed them after all. It's not hard to imagine the crippled man in Mark 2:1-12 holding on to his faith in Jesus despite everyone else in Jerusalem rejecting him as a failed Messiah. He with his friends could have been heartbroken to see Jesus crucified, and eager to mourn and honor the great teacher at his burial site. Given Jesus' teaching of how the poor and the meek will be first in the kingdom of heaven, it makes sense that you would have people like this coming to see the resurrected Christ in the empty tomb.
But again, this suffers from the same problem. Does it fit as good or better than women finding the tomb. And I don't think that it accomplishes it. And I don't think that it actually satisfies all the narrative need all that well compared to the women finding the tomb empty. Because the implication here at the very end of Mark's gospel, and I guess maybe all the gospels, is that everybody had given up on Jesus. Everybody lost faith. Everybody thought that Jesus was dead and that was it, except for those that were least amongst his ministry, meaning the women. It was definitely implied in Mark's gospel that they, even though Jesus was treating them better, in some respects, like treating them more respectfully in some respects, but it's very clear that Jesus recognized that women were in the lower part of the social order in Jewish culture, and he was perfectly fine with them being in that lower order. In fact, he needed them to be in that lowest position in the social ladder. That's what Jesus needed from them. And so that's why they were picked to find the empty tomb. No matter how many other like poor or disenfranchised people you can suggest, it's never going to be any more perfect of a pick than women finding the tomb empty, specifically the women in Jesus's ministry.
Here's the point. While women were low in the caste system of ancient Jewish culture, nothing about that necessitates that it be them discovering the empty tomb.
Well, except the entire narrative up until that point, the fact that God is always looking to use the least amongst the Jewish population in order to emphasize his influence. Other than all of that background information and that cultural context and narrative context, yeah, sure, I agree. There's nothing that necessitates it other than all of the evidence that necessitates it.
And that Mark would specifically invent an empty tomb narrative with women when there's so many better options. And the reason why is because there's nothing that stops a poor, sick, or middle-class man from giving testimony, so long he is 1, not a slave, 2, does not have a dishonest occupation, 3, is not a direct family member of the accused, and 4, is physically able and mentally competent to witness an event and verbally give testimony.
Okay, well, I get it. We're talking about Jewish courts of law, I believe. This has no bearing on the narrative story that's being written. It has no bearing on somebody finding the tomb and telling others about it. Like, this wasn't a court case or something like that. Like, this isn't John Grisham presents the crucifixion of Jesus or something like that. This has no bearing on whether or not the men that he's already presented as being as good or better picks for finding the empty tomb from a narrative perspective. This has no bearing on whether or not they would actually fit the story that's being written. It's just saying, oh, all of these guys could give testimony in court. Good for them. Women can give testimony in court too. Although in court, normally women don't give testimony just because court is not seen as like a woman's place to be in. Like it's kind of one of those cultural things where women just weren't seen in court all that often. Doesn't mean that they weren't able to give testimony. It was kind of unseemly for them to be in court. Kind of like it was like an insult to the woman for them to be in court. And I guess maybe an insult to the court too. I don't know. They were misogynists. Who knows?
Even the discernment of a sick, impoverished, or Gentile individual was still considered better than that of a woman. The skeptic here then wants to say that Mark's intention was to fulfill this literary motif and provide an apologetic for the empty tomb.
So basically he's using the argument that women's testimony in court was taken as being less credible or less sought after than a man's. As we've seen through Josephus's works, where he records women actually testifying in court, either directly or through a proxy. It wasn't a question of whether or not they could be trusted or that they weren't allowing or seeking women's testimony. It's just that it was unseemly for women to be in court. Like that's just it. Like it just wasn't a woman's place to be in court as far as they culturally understood things. So none of this has any kind of bearing on whether or not women finding the empty tomb is a historical event, because it's not happening in court, and this is just some anecdotal narrative that's being told. Whether it's historical or not, it's still just a narrative that's being told.
But given the considerations we just saw, it doesn't make sense to provide an apologetic of women fulfilling this empty tomb and fulfilling this first will be the last motif. If Mark's primary concern was apologetics rather than conveying accurate history, this would not be the move he's trying to make.
Actually, I think it's the exact move that he would make because it hits all of the points and it satisfactorily fills the narrative and theological need of the author, or at least as indicated by the story so far. Presenting some other course of events for Mark's narrative without changing Mark's narrative completely totally derails the entire message of the gospel. So I don't understand why suggesting just changing the ending right here, he thinks that it's all perfectly fine. Sure, if you're a shitty fucking writer, which I'm not saying that the author of Mark was a good writer, but at least he was trained in these pagan schools where they learned how to write stories. And I feel like even a first century pagan schoolboy would have been like, this is a fucked up story. This is not a good story. Like, I feel like the proposed alternatives that Than has suggested so far, they would all be rejected by the populace. Like, nobody would consider that a good story. It breaks the themes, it breaks the story, it breaks the theological needs of the characters. Like, it breaks everything.
Even if Mark wants to fulfill this first will be the last motif, there's still better options on the table for Mark.
So not greater, but better this time. And I don't think that they're better. In fact, I feel like these options degrade the story, making them least likely to be used or to have come about. I feel like the path of least resistance here, as far as like constructing this story, is definitely to use the women finding the tomb empty.
Now, one anticipated objection to what I'm saying here is that women traditionally performed the burial rites. But this depends on a misunderstanding of Jewish funerary practices and the role of gender within the ceremonial elements of burial and mourning. It's true that a female corpse was typically buried by females, besides the fact that a husband could sometimes bury his wife. Semitic law states that a male corpse can be devised for its funeral by either gender. In the early Talmudic tractate, we encounter the following law without a commentary. A man may shroud and gird the corpse of a man, but not that of a woman. A woman may shroud and gird the corpse of a man or of a woman. In fact, it was even customary for Jewish men to be buried by his sons. There's countless examples in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament where a man's corpse is buried by other men. For example, Abraham is buried by his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac is buried by Jacob and Esau. Jacob is buried by his sons and by his people. The Gospels mention that it was the son's role to bury his deceased father. John the Baptist is buried by his disciples, which were very likely men. Stephen is buried by godly men after his martyrdom. Furthermore, in the Gospels, it's Joseph of Arimathea preparing the body for burial, not women. The Gospels record the women viewing this from a distance, but in no way imply that the women tried to assist here. So if the Gospels had no issue presenting Jesus as being primarily entombed by a Sanhedrin member, and Jewish law and tradition shows precedence for men taking active roles in funerary customs, then there's no real reason why an invented narrative would necessarily include women as the sole witnesses to the empty tomb, not to mention that there would have been better options for Mark if he indeed even wanted to invent this narrative.
So all of the men and everything like that laying Jesus to rest and then giving up on Jesus. The women were the ones that retained faith in Jesus and a love for Jesus, and so at least enough to want to go back and show their respects and all that, or anoint the body rather. I feel like doing all of that better serves this theological and narrative purpose, because in the narrative, everybody's given up on Jesus except for the women. The women are the ones that are last to see Jesus die on the cross. They are the ones that are still there when he dies. They are the ones that see where he is buried. They show their commitment to Jesus throughout the narrative. So why on earth, when Mark is trying to convey that everybody has given up on Jesus except for the women, would then Mark have men find the tomb empty when it's obvious that all of the men have given up on Jesus? Like just like all the other disciples, everybody else has given up on Jesus. Nobody thinks that he's going to resurrect from the dead. Nobody cares that he's dead anymore. I mean, like, people care because now the movement's dead or whatever in the fuck. But like, the only ones that remain faithful, at least until the angel reveals that Jesus is resurrected, are the women. The women remain faithful till the end to see Jesus resurrect, and only then do they end up failing. Ultimately, everybody fails follows Jesus. And that's the message. Humanity will fail God. It's consistent throughout the Bible. Humanity always fails God. Somebody comes back and redeems humanity. Obviously, there are several, quote unquote, redeemers throughout the Bible, but, Jesus is supposed to be the great redeemer. Jesus is the one who redeems humanity after humanity has failed. And what better way to communicate that humanity has failed is to have the women find the tomb empty and run away scared and not tell anybody. That is the very last group that held on to the faith until they ran away scared, and even they lost faith. This whole narrative, like, the more you think about it, the women finding the tomb empty is narratively needed. Like, that's just the thing that makes the most sense given the themes of the gospel, Mark's gospel, that is. So this is narratively needed. There's no way around that. Men finding the tomb empty actually degrades the message of Mark's gospel.
It's for these reasons that critical scholars see the inclusion of women at the empty tomb narratives as one of the strongest evidential chips in favor for the authenticity of this pericope. For example, the German scholar Raymond Schweger claims that the majority of the New Testament historians usually give a positive assessment to the aspect of women finding the tomb empty on Sunday morning, and therefore regard it as genuine. And even non-Christian scholars who have historically been against Christianity and critics of Christianity say the same thing. Take the words of the late prominent atheist Christopher Hitchens, admitting that the witness of the women at the empty tomb is remarkable for that time period. Although he does deny the historicity of the resurrection account, he states, "What religion that wants its fabrication to be believed is going to say, 'You've got to believe it, because we have some illiterate, hysterical girls who said they saw this.'"
So basically, he has a scholar from 1993 just broadly saying, oh, everybody agrees that the empty tomb is a historical event and that women actually did find the tomb empty. Just baselessly saying this is not going to be convincing. I don't know if that scholar listed off a number of other scholars to suggest that it is an overwhelming consensus, and it may have been at the time in 1993. I would love to see some kind of survey of critical scholarship on this matter now, in 2024. Because, 93 was nearly 30 years ago. My guess is that opinions have changed since then. And then, obviously, Hitchens. Now, obviously, I disagree with Hitchens on a number of his statements that he made before he died. One of those being like, oh, Jesus was probably a historical figure because why have him come from two different towns? That just made sense to him. And just like right here, it makes sense to Hitchens, absent of modern scholarship of this idea that women finding the tomb empty. Maybe it's like, it seems plausible that they actually did find the tomb empty. Maybe that's what Hitchens is meaning here, but I still disagree with him. And I disagree with a number of atheists on the topic of what is historical in the Gospels. I find that to be rather weird that, I'm in disagreement with a lot of atheists on how historical the Gospels are, but ultimately, I don't care what either of these people say. One person from 1993 saying everybody agrees with his position doesn't convince me of anything. I'm not saying that at the time people didn't consider it to be a historical fact. All I'm saying is that it was nearly 30 years ago that this was said. It doesn't take into account any of the modern scholarship that has examined the historicity of the Gospels or the reliability of the Gospels. It is ignorant because it's so far in the past of modern revelations that we've had about the historicity of the gospel. So I feel like maybe getting some more recent scholarship on this, more recent surveys or something like that, would definitely help this argument.
When you assess the data from both sides, one side being that this is a historical account, and the other that Mark invented this motif to serve some literary purpose and apologetic purpose, the data supports the authenticity of this account.
I don't think that the data does, because all of the data, like the narrative context, the theological context of the Mark's gospel, and all of that only seems to serve up the women finding the tomb empty as the perfect ending for Mark's gospel. So I don't see Than's point here. I don't agree with Than's point. I don't think that he's got a great argument. I think he needs to tweak things a little bit here, but ultimately I found that the argument that he's making resides on this whole idea that, oh, they wouldn't fabricate women finding the tomb empty. That's just not something that they would do. They would fabricate somebody else finding it. But as we've examined with the narrative needs of Mark's gospel and the theological needs of Mark's gospel, women finding the tomb empty is the perfect ending. It definitely emphasizes all of the themes that are contained in Mark. Changing the ending of Mark breaks everything that Mark's gospel is building up to. Everything that Mark's gospel is doing builds up to the moment that Jesus resurrects. And it's revealed that he's resurrected by this divine being to the women. Everything builds up to that point. If you change it, you totally just yanked the foundation from the entire building that Mark is constructing. And I don't think that actually serves like Mark at all. It doesn't serve the story at all. Turns it into a worse story. Why would you make an argument that says, oh, well, Mark's story could be worse if we constructed it differently like this. So obviously we are going to sit here and say that a worse story is actually a better story. I don't see how that's better. Like, I feel like Mark's gospel is constructed in the way that it's constructed. Now, if you want to change the ending, fine, go ahead, but you got to change the entire story. You got to change all of the themes that are present throughout it. You got to change the basic theology that's presented in Mark's gospel. You got to change all of that shit so that it leads up to a point where men finding the tomb empty is what you would expect. But as it stands right now, if you're only going to change out that last section of the gospel, then you have a broken story, because the ending of the gospel necessitates that women find the tomb empty. Anyways, that's all of Than's video. I hope that you guys enjoyed this response today. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about Than's argument. Do you think that he's got a solid argument here, or do you think that he needs to rework things a little bit? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.